Hello, friends. Lee C. Camp here. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. This is our unabridged interview with Professor Sonja Lyubomirsky. Professor Lyubomirsky is one of the world's leading researchers on human happiness. I was delighted to get to interview her because I've been using one of her books for one of my undergraduate classes for a long time now, called The How of Happiness. It's a sort of scientific investigation into the mechanisms of human well-being, human flourishing, human happiness. 12 practices that she and or others have studied in labs, treating them as interventions of sorts. That is, just as one might study through randomized clinical trials certain vaccines, they studied in the same way, randomized clinical trials, certain practices to see the impact that those practices would have upon our happiness. Then, in time, one of the things that she began to learn was that so many of those practices related to human connection. That is, they related to whether or not we have a sense that we are loved ourselves by others around us, that those that are especially happy report especially feeling loved by others. Well, what sorts of interventions might there be that make that possible? And that's what her latest book is about. And thus, we had in this wonderful conversation both a discussion about her earlier book and her most recent book. A great conversation. I hope you find this immensely helpful. Here's Professor Sonja Lyubomirsky. Professor Lyubomirsky, welcome.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm delighted to have you with us. As I was telling you before we started taping, I started using your book, The How of Happiness, in one of my undergraduate classes, maybe a decade ago. But it's blessed and been a gift to a lot of people, and I thank you for your work.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that book is still resonating, years later with people because it was about sort of 12 different ways to become happier. And so, yeah, I think most people want to be happy.
Yes, indeed, indeed. Yeah. A lot of the philosophers and a lot of the theologians would say that's kind of the ultimate question. And here you are having fashioned a career about one of the ultimate questions of being human. And so I wonder if you think back to your childhood as your family being Russian immigrants, what was it in your childhood maybe that perhaps first enkindled in you an interest in questions about happiness?
Mm-hmm. A couple of things. I think one says I immigrated from the Soviet Union when I was 9 years old, and I noticed right away the cultural differences. Russians don't look happy when you encounter them on the street. Doesn't mean they are actually a little less happier than Americans on average. But if you go into their homes, people are drinking and singing. So actually, they're quite vibrant and cheerful. But anyway, I noticed cultural differences. So that was one of the interests I had. And then when we immigrated, my mom became really unhappy because, it was so hard for her to leave her. I think she didn't realize how hard it was for her to leave her home country. And Russians are very much, they love just the earth and they're very, very connected to the land, to the country, to the people, the culture. And so then I also was always interested in why, how to make her happier. And actually, my college honors thesis advisor, who I hadn't seen in 30 years, came to visit me a few years ago, and which is interesting to see someone who knew me when I was 19, 20, 21, and then didn't know me, in the intervening years, which is that sort of biasing. And then and he said, "Yeah, you were really interested in happiness when you were in college. You talked about that a lot." And I didn't realize that. I thought it started in grad school, actually, my interest. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Did you say that he said that when you were in college, you were interested in happiness, or that you were unhappy?
No, that I was interested in the subject of happiness. And I brought it up a lot, whether it's about my mom or other questions that, as a research topic. And I did not remember that.
Yeah. So you then go on after your undergrad, you go to Stanford, and I've read this story about some kind of revelatory moment that occurs as you're walking through a Rodin sculpture garden at Stanford. But how did that then enkindle further interest in the subject?
Yeah, so the very first day of grad school, I met with my new advisor. His name is Lee Ross, and he was the world's expert on conflict and negotiation, so kind of the opposite to happiness. He was studying back then. He was studying Palestinians and Israelis and how to get them, how to reduce conflict. And we took this walk, and I think he was the one to ask the question, out of the blue, what is the secret to happiness? And why are some people happier than others? So we just started talking about it. And then back then, only one person, Ed Diener, was studying happiness. He didn't even call it happiness. He called it subjective well-being. There really was no field of the science of happiness.
Yeah.
This was in 1989.
Huh.
Yeah.
So I would presume, given that there's only one person studying it, here you are, an aspiring young graduate student in scientific fields. Did that feel somewhat threatening or unprofessional to pursue a question about happiness?
Totally. I mean, I'm in this department, top psychology department. Amos Tversky was on the faculty, Lee Ross, really, really like top scholars, Gordon Bauer studying memory. And they're all like doing these like fancy experiments, studying mechanisms, like, testing very specific hypotheses. And I'm like interviewing people like who are happy and unhappy. I mean, because we have to start with sort of descriptive research before you can go on to like correlational research and then finally experimental research. So I felt very insecure. I felt like I was studying something. Well, people told me like I was crazy, basically, that it was very like fuzzy and unscientific, and you can't really study happiness. People still tell me that sometimes. But back then, in fact, sometimes I have a grad school buddy who I saw again years later, and he was like, "Wow, you were really brave to study happiness at grad school." And I never thought of it that way because I just felt like kind of insecure. But yeah, that was a different time.
Yeah. When you did that early descriptive work, what were things that you began to see in simply trying to describe who's unhappy, particularly unhappy, who's particularly happy?
Sure. Well, great question. I still remember the very first question I had was I thought that it was about social comparison, how we compare ourselves to others. I had this sort of idea that, well, people who are happier, they must kind of compare down. They compare themselves to people who are worse off, so they feel better about themselves. And people who are unhappy probably compare up. It's called upward social comparison. And they think, oh, that person is more attractive or richer or smarter than me, so that's why they're unhappy. And it's a reasonable hypothesis, but I was completely wrong. And when I asked people who are happy and unhappy who they compare themselves to, the sort of less happy people would tell me all these stories. Oh, yes, I compare themselves to this person. It makes me feel bad, et cetera. But the happy people almost like didn't know what I was talking about. They were like, what do you mean?
Fascinating.
And it's not that they didn't compare, but it just wasn't part of their like internal life. Like they didn't let those comparisons affect their self-esteem and their sort of, mood as much. And so I was wrong. I mean, people who are happy just don't compare themselves as much or don't let it affect them as much.
That's so fascinating. So in some writing on moral formation, there is a lot of conversation about moral exemplars and the importance of moral exemplars in moral formation. So how do you distinguish between helpful comparison or attention to a moral exemplar for the sake of one's own moral formation and this sort of destructive or at least related to unhappiness comparison that we'd want to stay away from?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's some research on this idea that some comparisons that are kind of get quote upward comparisons, they are inspiring, right? I mean, I guess I think of I don't know much about moral exemplars, but that's such an interesting way to look at it. But let's say, you want to, play the violin and there's like a violin virtuoso that you look up to and you don't feel bad. They're like, oh my God, I'm not as good as them. You actually are inspired and you want to be like them. But what happens is when you compare yourself to someone who's like kind of very close to you, so maybe it's your classmate who's like a little better, then that could be useful because it sort of sets a goal for you, maybe like a standard. But sometimes we feel worse. So I think someone who's sort of a lot more virtuous or a lot more excellent at something that you are actually can be like a very helpful comparison.
Yeah. So let me ask you to give us a working definition, or maybe your working definition of happiness.
Sure. Well, I define happiness the way that Ed Diener defined happiness. So he's the founder of the science of well-being that I mentioned, was doing research in the 80s. He really was the first one. I mean, there are people in economics, other fields that were studying subjective well-being too in a different way. So he defines happiness as having two components. And I think of it as being happy in your life and being happy with your life. Being happy with your life is basically thinking your life is good, being satisfied with your life, thinking you're making progress towards your goals at a good pace. But being happy in your life is really the experience of positive emotions, right? Sort of throughout the day or the week. Sometimes you experience joy, serenity, enthusiasm, affection, curiosity, pride. Depending on the person, you might experience a different mix. Of course, happy people also experience negative emotions. that's also adaptive when it's, when it's not chronic or too intense, right? And so, so really being happy in your life and being happy with your life are the two components of happiness.
So if I understand you correctly, with your life, there is a sort of circumstantial component, that there are certain circumstances about your life that you're satisfied with or grateful for, or Great. So then you move from descriptive work, and then with the How of Happiness, you're looking much more at causal factors and or potential interventions to help elevate self-reports, I suppose, on happiness. So kind of describe the move that you make there theoretically of what the question you're beginning to ask there.
Right. Well, from the beginning, reporters, journalists started calling me, even in grad school. And they would ask me questions like, well, what does your work suggest to our readers? Like, what should our readers do to be happier? So just getting back to that social comparison work, I did this research showing that, happy people don't compare themselves as much. So they said, should we tell our readers that happy people should compare themselves, that one should not compare themselves as much to others? And I would always say, I don't know, right? Because it's a correlation.
Right.
Of course, they hate that answer, right? I'm like, well, it depends. I don't know. It's a correlate. Just because something's correlated doesn't mean it's causal, right? And I also thought I was kind of elitist, and I thought, well, this is a very applied question. I am a basic scientist, but this question of how people can become happier sort of intentionally is applied. And I was really misguided, because really that basic and applied science question, they all go together, they're intertwined. And the question of how people can become happier is actually a very interesting basic science question too. And so I started doing what I call happiness interventions. So my lab actually pioneered happiness interventions in 1998. So when Bill Clinton was president, a long time ago. So we started doing these interventions. They're basically clinical trials, but instead of testing a vaccine, we all know about clinical trials for vaccines, or a medication, we're testing a happiness practice. So we might randomly assign, these are all randomized controlled trials, we randomly assign a certain number of people to express gratitude in a particular way, maybe express gratitude in a different way, and then maybe do something neutral. And then we follow them across time and measure their happiness and some other outcomes to see what works best.
And then that leads kind of somewhat famously to your pie analogy in the How of Happiness. So would you describe that for us?
Sure. And I don't actually, I actually regret using that pie analogy because people take the numbers that we set out too seriously. But basically the way I'll describe it is that when you think about what are the contributors to happiness, what are the main contributors to happiness, there are really three sort of buckets of influences on happiness. And the first bucket is genetics. And it's pretty clear, our genes, and there's not single gene, there's, thousands of genes, and they get turned on and off. Influence our happiness, right? Some people are just kind of born with a kind of a set range that is higher or lower than others. The second set of influences on happiness are our life circumstances, right? So it's also pretty clear then, if you're richer versus poorer, where you live and how old you are and how much money you make and whether you're married, that does influence your happiness, especially if your circumstances are not good, So, obviously, if you don't have any money, if you live in a war zone, and if you're in a bad relationship, right, that's going to make you really unhappy. So that's the second set of influences. The third set of influences is really what I study with the interventions, is that those are the things that we can actually really control every day. The ways that we think, the ways that we behave, we can control, that can influence how happy we are. And so that's what the interventions are testing.
Yeah. You said that you regretted perhaps the way people made the numbers. If I remember correctly, you've got what you posited was maybe 50% genetics, 10% circumstances, and 40% is the things that we can control. And I had always kind of presumed that you meant that as a sort of suggestive sort of delineation of categories there. But I think the one that is most surprising to people is that, give or take on the number again, but that you're suggesting that circumstances have a much lower correlation or relation to our happiness than most of us presume. So expound upon that for us some.
Right. So again, I regret putting exact numbers on them, although the numbers came from the studies that were available to us in that time that we wrote the paper, which was in the early 2000s. So the circumstances don't affect our happiness as much as we think they will, especially, but this really applies to people who are already kind of relatively comfortable, right? So again, if you live in poverty, if you live in a war zone, if you're in an abusive relationship, your life circumstances are going to have like a 90%, effect on your happiness. By the way, the percentages actually, refer to population differences. So I don't want to go into the statistics, but if maybe most of your listeners are like relatively comfortable, they're not, really suffering in their circumstances, then, improving your circumstances is probably not going to change your happiness as much as you think it will. It probably will at the beginning, so you move into a nicer apartment, you change your job to a better job. You buy a new car, right? So that will probably make you happier. But then over time, we tend to kind of revert back to our baseline. So my second book, The Myths of Happiness, is really about that. But not always. I mean, we can actually behave in ways that we don't adapt. So I was telling you at the beginning of our talk that I have a view in my apartment. And I love the view. I have adapted to it. So it's not as stunning today as it was the first weeks that I moved in, but I haven't adapted completely. So I think it is certainly possible to change your circumstance and still enjoy it, or a new job. You really can still enjoy your new job 10 years later. A new relationship you can still enjoy, 20 years later, but not everyone does, right? Yeah. Some people just kind of adapt.
Yeah. But explicit there is this assertion that there are still things that you really can focus on that can have some sort of upward impact upon your happiness. So you list 12, you discuss 12 in the book and give various exercises for those 12 practices. What are some that among those 12 that have especially stood out to you that you've continued to see the research has supported those in very helpful ways?
Sure. Well, I've focused really on 3 in my research, but there's probably 100. When you think about how, or more than 100, what can people do to be happy today? One of the practices that I've really focused a lot on in my research career is gratitude. I think it's under the umbrella of sort of positive thinking, and we shouldn't be sort of thinking positive all the time. That's not healthy. But I think gratitude is so powerful, so rich, such an interesting, fascinating, actually, state to study. We all have a lot to be grateful for, sort of no matter what our circumstances is. And so, so I've done a lot of research on the power of gratitude to make us feel more connected, to make us happier. So gratitude is one. Another one is doing acts of kindness for others, sort of doing good for others. It takes the focus off of yourself. One of the most sort of toxic things actually is sort of too much self-focus. And so anything you can do to take the focus off of you and onto others, I think, can make people happier. Again, it makes you feel more connected to help others, whether it's, your cousin, helping them move, or taking your nephew out to the circus, or helping your neighbor, or giving to charity, or opening the door for someone. It could be really like a variety of kind acts. So we do a lot of studies where we prompt people to do more kind acts sort of every week. They normally do. We even show that it gets under the skin. We take blood before and after a kind acts intervention. And we find that people who do kind acts for others, they actually show changes in their gene expression, immune gene expression that associated with a healthier immune profile. So we have lots of research on that. And so after all these years, so we kept doing these interventions, and it hit me one day that all of these interventions, especially sort of these gratitude and kindness interventions, the reason they work to make us happier is that they make us feel more connected to others, right? So when I write a gratitude letter to my mom or my best friend, it makes me feel more connected to her, and more loved by her, and when I do, when I help others, right, it makes me feel closer to those people. And so then I started thinking, well, maybe it's really all about connection. And so then we started researching just asking people just to be more social and just do something to connect with others. So one of the first studies, we asked people just to act more extroverted for a week, just to kind of be more social, engage in more social interaction. We've done studies where we ask people this week, engage in 3 more social interactions that you don't normally engage in, call a friend or chat with someone by the water cooler at work. And people feel more connected, they feel happier. And then we started studying conversations, like, because it turns out that like just having a conversation with someone makes people happier on average, right? Sometimes conversations don't go well, right?
Right.
And you're kind of do this for work as a kind of professional conversation, but I think I'm sure you understand the value and the rewards of having conversations.
Right.
Yeah.
So many things I want to follow up there on. Let's go back to gratitude just a second. What are some of your favorite gratitude exercises? Or let's say somebody's listening and they think, yeah, I'm just not very good at that. So where to start?
Sure. It really depends on the person. I think everyone, can choose whatever kind of fits their personality or fits their kind of lifestyle or fits their values. For me, I think writing gratitude letters or writing gratitude texts or something like that is very meaningful and easy, or easy if it's, short. We actually are doing a study where we're asking people to use ChatGPT to help them write gratitude letters. Because if it's just kind of a barrier, like, oh, I don't know where to start, or maybe I just don't feel like I'm a good writer, it could help you get started. I would say gratitude letters, gratitude texts, are the most meaningful to me.
Yeah.
But I've talked to people who are like artists, and they might like draw something that they're grateful for, or they create like a gratitude collage, or they call someone on the phone and they just tell them on the phone that they're grateful. So
for me, I learned the old gratitude list years ago, and just writing 10 things down in the morning that I'm grateful for, and I kind of push myself to make that a mix of things historically that I'm grateful for, things just right in the moment that are very tangible, like a cup of coffee or the dog curled up next to me in a mix. And then I also noticed that sometimes I would go through seasons where I would do that so often it became a chore. And so maybe it was reading your book that I saw, oh yeah, other people have that experience too. And so I would start letting Friday be my gratitude day, where I would take a long walk and I would count up 50 things I was grateful for on my walk. And it just had this huge boost in my happiness, So I just find all that stuff just so
I love that. And 50 things. And me too, actually. Yeah. And we've done some research showing that you don't want it to be, so habitual that it becomes a chore. You kind of adapt to it. And so I have actually a practice on Sunday mornings where I write down like what I'm grateful for that happened that week.
Nice.
And I just keep that on my computer. And actually, sometimes just going through that is really, reading what you wrote is also really rewarding. So
yeah. Kindness. So you're saying that we can actually see changes at a genetic expression level.
Yeah, this is I'm not a biologist, but I have a colleague and actually someone I went to grad school with, Steve Cole, who is. So we've teamed up and have done a number of studies now where we take blood from participants. We randomly assign them either to do acts of kindness for others or do acts of kindness for themselves, which is actually kind of a nice comparison. When you do something nice for yourself, it could be something self-indulgent. It could be like having a piece of chocolate or taking a nap or getting a massage, but it basically could be self-care, right? So it's something for yourself, which is also, it's good to do, but it's different from helping others. And then we also have other control groups. And then what he analyzes the blood sort of before and after. And again, we find that these are immune cells in the blood that we're looking at, that we see changes in RNA gene expression, where we have a reduction of pro-inflammatory gene expression. So I think more inflammation is bad, right? So you have sort of reduced pro-inflammatory, downregulation, sort of pro-inflammatory gene expression. And then in at least one study, we also have showed greater antiviral gene expression. So pretty cool. Again, these are biomarkers. They're not actually health. They're kind of indicators of health, but still nice to show.
Yeah. You mentioned you didn't use the label a moment ago, but talk to us a little bit more about hedonic adaptation, what that is and what we've learned about that.
Sure. So hedonic adaptation is the phenomenon that human beings are very good at sort of getting used to or becoming accustomed to changes in our lives, especially positive changes. So again, you move to a nicer home, and at first you really appreciate, and the nicer surroundings. But then after a time, you kind of stop noticing, and you get used to it. And then you start thinking, oh, I really want to like renovate my bathroom, because it's not as nice as I'd like it to be. So human beings always kind of want more. And I always argue, well, I'm not the only one to argue, that hedonic adaptation is actually evolutionarily adaptive, right? That the idea that the humans we always want more. Like we sort of reach a goal and then we adapt to that goal and then we want to reach the next goal. And if we didn't have if that process wasn't evident, maybe we would just sort of stagnate and we just kind of reach a goal and we just sort of stop, and not wanting to progress. So maybe progress advances would stop. So, but there's a cost to happiness, because if you get accustomed to your car or to your wife or to your job, you won't be as happy. Yeah. It's a challenge to happiness.
So how do you think about, one could think of hedonic adaptation, as you said, as a driver towards human progress, cultural progress. And at the same time, one could think of it as a driver in greed that's going to be deeply unsatisfying. So how do we navigate that in such a way so that it's helpful and constructive to us as opposed to destructive?
Yeah, great. Actually, I've never actually been asked that question because it's like it's sort of a balance, right? That and maybe part of it has to do with what the goals are. There's research on different kinds of goals. There's extrinsic goals and intrinsic goals. And extrinsic goals are goals, basically, those are goals to make more money, to be sort of more famous, more beautiful, more powerful, higher status. And those goals tend to be are not associated with happiness, or maybe even associated sometimes with unhappiness. And they're also the kind of goals that we adapt to the fastest, like you make more money and then you just want more money. And actually one of my favorite findings is that everyone, basically, if you ask them, if you made 10%, higher salary tomorrow, would you be happier? And they say, sure. And I would say, yes, I'd like to make 10% more. And then of course, once you make 10% more, you're like, yeah, I'd like to another 10%. But intrinsic goals are goals that have to do with, connecting to others, contributing to community, personal growth, learning new things. And those are things that we don't adapt. We still might adapt to them a little bit, but we don't adapt as fast. And they're also goals that really are, help the human beings kind of advance. So I guess that's one of my answers.
Yeah.
Focus more on the intrinsic goals.
So did I understand you to say that there has been research on the fact that there's slower hedonic adaptation with regard to intrinsic goods?
Yeah, I'm not sure if they've directly compared it, but I believe there's lots of evidence that I could kind of put together. Yeah. And it would suggest that. Yeah. That you don't adapt to, your friendships,
right,
as fast as you might adapt to sort of becoming more beautiful or more rich or more famous. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was trying to get my head around a way to ask this next question, and so I spent a little bit of time thinking about how I wanted to say this next one, because it's kind of been rumbling in the back of my mind for a few years now. And that's the question about instrumentalizing these practices. And so what I mean by that, right? So with Aristotle, for example, the happy person is the good person, that you seek these intrinsic goods because they are good in and of themselves, and happiness is seen as a sort of concomitant with goodness. And yet there seems to be, when we think about interventions, say, of, practice this intervention and you'll be happier, it's almost as if one potential danger of that could be that we're instrumentalizing it. So for example, I express gratitude to my father for his love for me. The danger would be that I'm now kind of using my father so that I can be happier. So how do you think about that?
Yeah. And that's an excellent question. It's an excellent question. I guess there's maybe a fine line, or maybe not even a fine line, between sort of at one point, are you just kind of like, it almost seems manipulative, right? Or strategic, right? Where you're, or transactional, where you're like doing something to make yourself happy. And we have this danger in our studies too, right? Because it's like I, the experimenter, is telling you, why don't you go write a letter of gratitude? Now, when we do that in our studies, we try to give the participants a lot of autonomy and sort of choice. We say, do 3 acts of kindness this week, but choose what you do, and we kind of get them to sort of own it, And And so, yeah, I guess I could say a lot about it. It's I think you could really kind of, as I said, you can kind of own it in a way that doesn't make it seem so kind of transactional or strategic or manipulative. I mean, that's one response. And another response, and I believe His Holiness the Dalai Lama actually talked about this, that there's nothing actually wrong with, like sort of benefiting in terms of your own happiness from helping others, right? So like, that's okay. Most things that we do in our lives actually have multiple determinants, right?
Right.
So like, like when kids study at school, they might study just to get good grades, but they also might study because they want to learn and want to, and that's okay to have those multiple motives. Like for most things, it's not so clean that we have these sort of virtuous motives versus non-virtuous motives. And it's okay to have multiple motives. And so it's okay to feel good when you show courage, or to feel happy when you express gratitude to your father. You could have multiple motives. I suppose if your motive is only your own happiness and you don't really care about your father very much, then that's not gonna, that's probably not gonna make you very happy.
Right.
Yeah. So I think it's okay. Like humans are complex, and we have multiple motives.
Yeah. Yeah, I find that quite helpful. Yeah. And I think for me as well, there's, when I was younger, I would encounter sometimes certain theological traditions that were very critical of any kind of pragmatism. They had this kind of notion of God's divine will as being, this is what God says, just do it and it's good, and it doesn't matter if it works, And I increasingly found that really odd. It's like, just from a theological perspective, it's like, if you believe that God is good and God has given us a life such that we are as we are, unless you think God is simply capricious and angry, but if you think God is good, then it seems to me that it would make sense that things that we think are good are also pragmatically true. And thus I can express kindness, gratitude, and thus it cultivates a genuine, mutually beneficial joy and happiness. But and it's somehow holding those together, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not a coincidence that those, it's interesting because I sometimes will get emails saying, everything you study is in the Bible, kindness and gratitude and forgiveness and the importance of relationships. And that's not a coincidence, right? That these are things really are good, and they're good for us, and they're evolutionarily adaptive.
Right.
And we believe they're good, and they also make us feel happy. It would be a weird world, right? If the things, obviously there are things that make us happy that are not good for us. So it might be like overeating or something, or taking dangerous drugs, or driving recklessly, right?
Or they at least give us a short-term dopamine rush, I suppose we could say.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. So in your before I go to your new book, I wonder what it's like for you personally, being something of the happiness guru. What's been the joy of that, and what's been the perils or pitfalls of that for you?
Sure. It's really been, I would say, 95% very positive. It's an amazing topic. I love studying what makes people happy. It's just so endlessly interesting. I don't always love, by the way, talking about it, right? So maybe that's a pitfall, like on an airplane. Like if I don't necessarily want to talk about my work. If I tell people I study happiness, almost everyone wants to know more about it. So I often will just not say anything if I want to just read my book. And maybe that's a pitfall. People are too interested. Also, there's lots of armchair psychologists or self-help gurus that are, they don't have much expertise. I think a lot of people have wisdom that just comes from their life experience, and that I actually really value. I think as I get older, I value more and more all kinds of different sort of evidence, or all kinds of wisdom, including my own. Now when I give advice about happiness, I kind of call it like science-backed wisdom. Like I use my own life experience and intuition as well. So it's not all based on like a particular experiment. But I'm trying to think of any other pitfalls. I don't think so. It's been a joy to find a career that's so rewarding. But a lot of people think that they sort of know, I guess, a lot about happiness, right? I guess that's the pitfall, the armchair psychologist.
Yeah. You said that a moment ago that in your work and looking at these various practices that contribute to happiness, that you began to wonder if all of them in some way don't simply contribute to social connection, relational connection. And so that seems to be the obvious connection to the new book, How to Feel Loved. So, maybe kind of give us the big framework there that is driving that new book.
Yeah. So I guess I'll kind of reiterate something that I said earlier, which is that, like my lab and I had been doing these interventions for like 25 years, and now 28 years. And so, it sort of hit me one day that almost all of the interventions that work to make us happier, they work because they make us feel more loved by or more connected to others. Now, you could argue, I go on a run or I meditate, and that's not necessarily about connection to others, although even some of those examples often involve connection. So it's not that every single happiness practice has to do with connection, but I mean, almost all of them do. And so it really made me, it sounds like a cliche, right? That made me realize like, wow, the secret to happiness is really feeling loved and feeling connected. And then I started talking to Harry Reese, who's my co-author of the book. And he's a love scientist, a relationship scientist, and has been studying relationships for 40 something years. So we started talking about that, and he agreed, kind of the difference between happy and unhappy people really is that happy people feel loved. And so we started sort of working on this book together, like a long time ago, actually, I think it's 7 years that I think it's 2018 is when we started. It's been a long process, but I think finally things really clicked. So we have a book called How to Feel Loved.
And then you suggest 5 different mindsets that are crucial in healthy connections, good connections. So maybe take us through a few of those.
Yeah.
Or maybe before we get to those, let's talk about the notion of being known versus being impressive. That again, I guess I suppose we tend to think that people will like us more if we can impress them. But you're pointing to there's a different way of going about this.
And exactly. So the book is called How to Feel. Actually, I just got it yesterday. The book is called How to Feel Loved, and so it's about what do you do to feel loved? So most people, when they want to feel loved, and by the way, we've done surveys, we find that about 70% will say that there's at least one relationship in their life that they want to feel more loved in. And it could be your child, parent, colleague, romantic partner, friend. But most of us think that to feel more loved, we need to sort of become more lovable. It's basically to sort of impress the person more with how lovable we are, how wonderful we are. And when you think about when you meet a new person, this is actually a great example. Like I'm meeting you, for the first time, at least on video. And, I want you to think that I'm, interesting and smart and kind and virtuous and funny, right? And so that's what we do often at a first meeting, whether it's on a first date or a professional meeting. And it does impress. I might succeed in impressing you. I might even get you to admire me, but it's not going to forge a connection, sort of this process where we just want to, sort of show off our good qualities and maybe hide our shortcomings. And it's hit us that really the secret to feeling loved is to be known, and to sort of for you to really know me and for me to really know you. It's kind of this idea that we're all walking around really with walls around us. When you think about it, it's so true. Like everyone just walks around with this wall around. And these walls are there to protect ourselves. Like they serve a purpose, but they prevent us from truly being known. And if you don't really know me, I think I'm going to argue that I'm never really going to feel loved by you, because I'm going to wonder if he really knew me, would he still love me? Right. So you really need so a lot of the book is about how do I become known to you, and how do I really truly know you? And that's where the 5 mindsets come in. And so like the first one we talk about, we call the sharing mindset. And that is like, I need to open up, like from you to know me, I need to open up and share something more about myself, not just my positive pieces, my positive parts. Maybe share vulnerably.
I want to talk about more of those mindsets in just a moment. But before we go to those, you also have a seesaw metaphor, that there's this sort of reciprocity of allowing ourselves to be seen and cultivating that in the other person. So kind of unpack that metaphor for us.
Sure. So the seesaw metaphor is this idea that you can, and we call it seesaw, we spell C with a S-E-A, like the sea. Because the idea is that imagine that you and I are sitting on a seesaw, but we're submerged in water. And most of ourselves are submerged in water. And this is sort of a metaphor that we keep most of ourselves hidden from you, right? Like I only show you kind of the tip of myself, which is sort of maybe the positive part. And you do too. And so what I do is I first start by kind of lifting you out. So my goal is kind of to lift you out of the water a little bit so I get to know you better. And so the first thing I do, and this is actually something maybe I could backtrack a little bit. The first step, if I want to feel more loved by you, is actually to make you feel more loved first. And the way I do it is by showing genuine curiosity in you. So really showing interest in your inner life, in your world, in sort of the details of your day. And so when I show real interest in you, the idea is that you will feel, you'll be moved to sort of share something about yourself. You'll feel also sort of safe and trusting. And so you will start kind of telling your stories, start telling me a little bit more about yourself or what you're feeling and thinking that day. And then when you do, I listen, and I really listen well. So we have a chapter on listening. Most of us are not very good listeners, including myself. Most of us, we argue, we listen to respond, right? Like, I'm not really listening. I'm just kind of rehearsing my answer. I'm rehearsing whatever I'm going to say to you. And so we recommend that people listen to learn, right? To listen, to really truly be present. So I'm showing curiosity in you. And that sort of I'm sort of pressing down on the seesaw. I'm lifting you out of the water a little bit, right? So you're showing a little bit more of yourself. You're telling me that your story, and now I'm listening to you, and I'm really interested, and I'm really caring. I'm asking you questions. Research shows that we don't ask each other enough questions that are real questions, that are deep questions. We think will be seen as prying or nosy, but actually, on average, people really want to be asked. So ask questions. And I'm also showing warmth and acceptance, because maybe you'll share something uncomfortable or something negative, and I'm really accepting. I sort of see you in your full humanity. So I'm lifting you out of the water, and then what happens next? You reciprocate, and reciprocity is one of the most powerful social norms, right? It's evolutionarily adaptive that we reciprocate, and so you reciprocate, and now you will. Hopefully show an interest in me that's genuine, and then I will start opening up and telling my story, and you also reciprocate with warmth and recognition and acceptance. It's really a gift, right?
Right.
That listening, the curiosity, the warmth and acceptance is really a gift to the other person.
Yeah.
So,
I love the emphasis there upon learning to ask good questions. So for you, what makes for a good set of questions in this kind of scenario?
Yeah, I love this topic too. Actually, my students and I are actually discussing right now, doing some more studies just on question asking. Because we don't ask enough questions of each other. Actually, I have an example. My oldest daughter has roommates. And she was telling me how one of her roommates was clearly having some kind of problem. Her family was coming over, and they were whispering about things that were happening. So I said to my daughter, why do you talk to your roommate? Ask her what's going on. And she said, "Oh, I can't do that, Mom. She'll think I'm prying." And that may be true in this case. Sometimes that does happen, but I think on average, people want to be asked. Like, I bet she will actually feel very much seen and recognized. Like, we want to be seen and heard. Anyway, so I'm a big proponent of asking questions. There's all these question decks, you can buy or get them off the web. My favorite is called The And, because their questions are really, really good questions, but there's so many of these. So I'm a fan of getting one of these question decks and using them. I have friends who do it on dates. They'll just bring questions with them and ask and ask questions. and they don't have to be like, and pacing is really important. So you don't start too deep. And also in terms of sharing too, you don't want to reveal your deepest secrets and traumas, no trauma dumping. Emotional intelligence is really needed here for the seesaw, is to really read the person, gauge their curiosity. Do they really want you to say more about yourself, and gauge for cues like, should I ask you that question now? Or maybe, because if I ask you a question that's too deep right now, you might, like, your walls might come right back up again, right? So it's going to backfire. So you have to really look for those cues. But some of my favorite questions are things like, it could just be like, what's been on your mind a lot lately? Because you could answer in lots of different ways.
Yeah.
Tell me about a family member this year who really surprised you, right? Or what's a mistake you made that you've learned a lot from, the best mistake you've made? The deeper questions are things like, when was the last time you cried, and why? What's a dream that you have not accomplished, and, why have you not achieved that dream? There's so many, right? There's so many questions. And I kind of hate small talk. I hate small talk. I'm done with small talk. I understand that sometimes you need it as a sort of a social lubricant, right? And by the way, small talk, there's research on if you do small talk with your barista at the coffee shop, that actually is beautiful. Like, or with the Uber driver, it helps you connect as a human to another human.
Yeah, it can be a form of kindness.
Total. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
In my mind, I've kind of thought of trying to keep a list of questions ready at hand that kind of become some of my go-tos. But I was just thinking, I think one of the most interesting questions I've heard someone suggest is one of their favorite questions to ask somebody came from David Brooks at the New York Times, or just recently at the New York Times. And he told me that one of his favorite questions is to ask someone, what question did I not ask you that you wish I had asked you? And I find that to be a very helpful question.
I love that.
Yeah.
Or what do you, well, I'm going to add to that. Actually, the deepest questions. Okay. Well, I'm going to add a few things to that.
Yeah.
One is, tell me more, which is just so simple. When you think about it, that's what we want. Like when it's really genuine, you really want to, tell me more. What happened next? What were you really thinking? What do you, another one is like, what do you wish people knew about you or that I knew about you that I don't, which is a little bit similar to that.
Yeah.
I love the David Brooks column and, his book, How to Know a Person.
Right.
Has some very, very relevant work in it. And then in this question deck that I mentioned, the end that I really like, and I don't make any money off of it or anything. I just like this question deck. But the deepest question, this is for people who know each other well, is, ask me. It's almost hard for me to say it because it's so deep. Ask me something you're afraid to ask me.
Wow!
Imagine that. Imagine a romantic, right?
Yeah.
Right. Ask me something like you've been afraid to ask me. Like, wow. Anyway, that's like the most advanced level.
Right.
You don't have to go there.
Yeah.
Great, but it's all like, again, people want to be. We crave to be seen and heard. One thing I like to think about, some people will tell you like the details of their day and they'll go on and on. They'll be like, oh, I went to run this errand and I couldn't find a parking space and then blah, 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 this happened. And, it's kind of boring, right, to listen to these details of the day. And yet they'll go on. And it's so interesting to me because as a psychologist, like it just shows you how we all want to be seen. Like they want people to know about the details of their day.
Right.
And if you show curiosity in the details of someone's inner life, like that's a gift. That's an act of kindness.
You talking about the seesaw metaphor, it made me start thinking about, if I'll pay attention to what I want, that oftentimes can give me great cues as to other things to offer to others. So the one that came to my mind is that, I realized years ago that I would find myself, let's say, I'm flashing back to a dinner that I had with some friends here lately. Mm-hmm. And we were sitting in a restaurant and someone had asked me a question and I started to tell a story that related to that question. And the waitress came and we went to order And then when the waitress left, someone else picked up the conversation completely somewhere differently. And which then made me think, okay, well, my story wasn't very interesting, or they didn't really want to hear. But what happened, of course, what I wanted someone to say is, Lee, finish your story. And I think that night someone actually did say that to me. But what it's taught me is that if I'm in that similar situation and somebody else is telling a story, one very simple way to help them feel loved is simply to say, hey, you didn't get to finish your story, finish telling your story. But I love that kind of reciprocity you're pointing us to, right? Is that whatever I feel, whether it's a gift to me or whether I feel somewhat overlooked, I can turn that around and then give that to somebody else. And then all of a sudden it's this beautiful kind of exchange.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think about that a lot. And I'll say like, oh, I'm sorry, I interrupted you earlier. You were saying, again, like, because it shows that you're really, you're listening, you're paying attention to that person, you're listening, you're making them feel seen,
right,
by doing that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So sharing mindset, listening to learn mindset, radical curiosity mindset, open heart mindset. Anything else you want to say about any of those four?
Yeah. An open heart, right. So I think I already kind of described. Open heart is basically showing warmth and compassion, and sort of believing in someone, wanting the other person to be happy, which is very important. And the last mindset is maybe I'll talk about that, which is one of my favorites. We call multiplicity, and it actually comes. I was told it comes from trauma research. The idea that if you have a trauma, it doesn't define you as a person. And so the idea that any kind of one trait and one behavior doesn't define you, that we are more than one thing, and that we really are many things, right? We're multitudes, as Walt Whitman said. We are like a quilt of both positive and negative qualities, right? So I can be loyal sometimes and narcissistic at other times, right? I'm kind sometimes and I'm selfish other times. And I think we're all like that.
Right.
And we kind of know that implicitly, but to really like bring that to the surface and to really like remember that. And when you look at others, right? So when someone is telling you their story, to really see them in their sort of messy kind of humanity, right? That we all have, these negative and positive qualities, and also to turn the multiplicity mindset onto yourself. Because when you behave badly, say, doesn't mean that you, by the way, condone or excuse that, but you sort of have compassion for yourself. That one behavior doesn't define you as a person.
Yeah. Well, what do you think are specific, concrete ways to facilitate bringing that mindset to, especially maybe fraught relationships or relationships that have been difficult?
Yeah, well, first of all, there's a lot of caveats, right? So if you're in a difficult relationship, sometimes you need to walk away from a relationship, right? So I don't, the research on forgiveness has this balance as well. Like, I think it's very, it's very important to forgive. It's sort of beneficial for lots of reasons. And yet there are times that person is not treating you well, and that sort of forgiving them is not going to be, it's going to be harmful to you, maybe. And so I guess I want to add that caveat. But assuming that the person really does, want to be better and mean well and want you to be happy, that I think using multiplicity is so powerful, and it's really hard as well. I think curiosity is also related. And so like in the middle of a conflict, to be curious instead of shutting down and being defensive. I think it's really, really hard to be like, wow, they are really angry. Like, why are they so angry? And where is that coming from? Multiplicity also suggests like really looking at the big picture. Looking at the triggers for that person. And we this happens all the time, right? Like I've been thinking about there's someone in my life right now who's sort of, I feel like not really showing up in our relationship as much as I would like them to. And I actually have been thinking about like multiplicity for them, as like thinking like, this is like where they are at there. This is the best they can do right now. Now I that may not be good enough, for me, but it's really helpful to sort of think like maybe they are sort of at capacity, and because of their history, or because of maybe they're depressed, maybe because of their family issues, whatever. Again, it's not condoning or excusing or justifying, but it is helping us understand that person's behavior, and then helping us to understand what to do next, right? Because sometimes we do want to walk away, and other times we, help and work with them, and
Yeah, thank you. I want to kind of move to maybe two or three unrelated questions as we kind of move towards a close.
Sure.
What I want to ask a little bit about in the How of Happiness, you talk about spirituality and or religious practice, and see that as one evidence-based strategy for well-being. And I read somewhere that you described yourself in the past as not having, I think this was a quote, a spiritual bone in your body. So what's that been like for you to investigate that, and how has that informed your own kind of lived experience?
It's actually hilarious because I have a friend who just still laughs at that line, and I don't think it's true. I mean, I think I did believe that at the time. I think now that I have more life experience, and I have a big picture, I sort of realize that like all humans are spiritual beings. So like it's almost, I almost kind of laughed at that line now. I think all of our bones, I guess, are spiritual. So it obviously depends on how you define spirituality. And so, well, a couple of things. In terms of religion, I look at the research, obviously religion is associated with so many good things, right? People who are religious are happier on like every level. Now you can look at sort of why, that, people who are religious or spiritual, report having greater meaning. They're better able to cope with adversity. They have stronger communities and relationships. And so all of those things, we can learn a lot from that research. And then with spirituality, again, I'm not an expert on this, but I think, I think there's a lot of sort of unknowns in the universe. I think it's actually kind of beautiful to sort of have these questions about like, what the universe has in store for us. So anyway, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but I think I do see this differently now than I did like more than 20 years ago that I wrote the first book. 25 years ago.
You had some time that you spent with the Dalai Lama. What was that experience like for you?
Yeah, so it was really incredible to spend time with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. We went to, my co-author Harry Reese and I, with a group led by Arthur Brooks, actually, we went to Dharamsala, India. And I had met him, I'd met His Holiness before years ago as well, a couple of times at various sort of dialogues. But this was really memorable, partly because it was in India. But there's a couple of lines a couple of things that His Holiness said that really stayed with me. One was, he said at one point, excessive self-focus is the door to all misery.
Oh my.
Excessive self-focus is the door to all misery, which I thought was so wise, and totally aligned with research. I was saying before how like anything we can do to take our mind and attention off of ourselves often is helpful, makes us happier. But then the other thing is he said that love is not a feeling, love is a decision. And I was like, wow, and it really hit me. I mean, you can interpret that in different ways, but I think our book How to Feel Loved is really about kind of making a decision about how to approach your next conversation differently. And I love that. That was a powerful one. Love is not a feeling. Love is a decision. Oh, one more thing I want to say that really affected me that I still talk to people about. He said, I'm your mother and you are my mother. We are all each other's mothers. And he said, how can we harm each other when we are all each other's mothers? So wow. It's like a Buddhist, I think it's an old Buddhist concept. And I'll sometimes talk to a friend and I'll say, or my kids, I'll say, I'm your mother, but you're also my mother.
That's lovely.
Is that beautiful?
That's beautiful.
Isn't that beautiful?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So what are you seeing with regard to tech, digital connection, or lack thereof with all of the research that you're doing?
Sure. I mean, lots to say there. Tech can certainly help us connect. And so I don't see it as sort of black and white, like kind of like all, texting and social media and all sort of are all bad, although there's a lot of costs. Anything that helps people connect to one another, I'm a fan of. And sometimes, these the technology can be amazing. We've had au pairs for our kids for many years, and they used to be really homesick. And then there came a time where they sort of stopped being homesick because they were constantly connected with their family and friends back at they're mostly from Germany. AI is a new challenge, to connection, but it also is helping people connect. People who are very, very lonely are finding like AI companions incredibly helpful, and so I don't want to judge. I'm not someone who really ever wants to have an AI companion, but I don't want to judge people who are really benefiting or benefiting from. There's a study that came out in China where women in China were using AI chatbots to help them to have conflict discussions with their husbands where they have less power in the relationship, and they actually are benefiting from these sort of role playing that they're doing. Is that amazing? And so I think there could be some benefits, and AI chatbots are the best listeners that you'll ever have in your life. They're the most curious, right? They'll remember everything you've ever said. They'll pick up that conversation whether you're interrupted, right? But I still, I believe that they can't make us feel as loved as actual humans. And in part because of authenticity, right? Because we need to believe that person has made a decision to make us feel loved and that really wants us to be happy. And they can fool us, just like when I go to a movie and I can laugh and cry and be scared, right? I know it's not real, and I think similarly, we're kind of fooled by them not being quote real. But it's something that's it's going to be a big challenge for our society to consider.
Yeah. Well, as we go out, if somebody's listening, they're drawn in by all of this fascinating research you've done and that you shared with us today. Where do they start? Where's one or two places they can start right now in putting some of this stuff into practice?
In terms of feeling loved. Showing curiosity first to make the other person feel loved. Choose someone in your life, one person, and ask them questions and show curiosity in them. But find something that you're genuinely curious about, right? Because it has to be genuine. You can't really fake. You can't fake it. And then truly listen to them and share more. In fact, when you think about like the polarized society we live in, all these like divides, across politics, religion, lots of things, identity, sharing vulnerably with one another is really helpful. A study actually just came out when people who are very different on the political spectrum, when they start sharing about their lives, like personal details, they actually feel much more connected and they feel like they understand each other better. So curiosity, listening, and sharing, I think are so important. So start with one person today, I would say.
Talking to Professor Sonja Lyubomirsky on her book from a number of years ago, The How of Happiness, and her most recent book, How to Feel Loved with Harry Reese. Professor, thank you. This has been a lovely conversation. Very grateful for your work and your time today.
Thank you so much, Lee. You've asked me a number of questions that have never been asked before, which is a huge compliment because I've been asked many questions over the past 30 years or so.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be with you. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Carrie Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, and Audrey Griffith. Our theme song was composed by Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor, it's a production of Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studio.